Sit close to the fire, if only in the imagination. This is not an attack on practice. It is not a rejection of Zen. It is a careful walk through a darker country, the place where practice stops revealing and begins protecting, where protection turns outward and becomes a weapon, where language that once opened the path begins to close the gate. Listen slowly. These matters are not difficult because they are obscure. They are difficult because they are familiar. The hardest chains are often the ones polished by devotion. Over the previous discussions in this series, we examined how Zen arrived already distorted, how practice becomes performance, how authority insulates itself, and how the liberatory project became therapeutic. Each of those movements was structural. None required malice. All required inattention. This discussion goes further. It enters the territory where distortion becomes active, where practice does not merely drift, but defends, where defense does not merely protect, but attacks, where the Dharma is not merely misunderstood, but weaponized. This is the warning part, and warnings, to be useful, must be plain. There is a stage in spiritual practice where nothing appears to be wrong. The student is still sitting, the posture is still there, the vocabulary is still there, the rituals are still there. There may be meditation, study, community, silence, sincerity, and discipline. From the outside, everything still resembles practice, but structurally, something has shifted. Practice is no longer functioning primarily as a way of seeing. It has begun functioning as a way of protecting. This is the defense stage. It does not usually announce itself. It rarely appears as obvious fear. It does not say, I am avoiding something. It says, I am just observing. It says, there is nothing to attain. It says, everything is already complete. It may even speak in the language of non-attachment, emptiness, compassion, silence, or enlightenment. And this is what makes the pattern difficult to detect. The words may remain correct while the function is changed. A teaching that once opened the student toward direct examination becomes a shield. A phrase that once pointed beyond conceptual fixation becomes a way of refusing further inquiry. A discipline that once exposed confusion becomes a structure for avoiding exposure. This is how practice becomes defense. Not all at once, that would be too mercifully obvious, and apparently existence has a sense of humor. It happens gradually. At first, practice reveals. The student notices anger, notices craving, notices fear, notices the restless construction of identity, notices the way thought builds a little kingdom, and then panics whenever anyone leans on the gate. Practice reveals the machinery, but then something else happens. The relief that comes from practice becomes attractive in itself. Calm becomes desirable. The student begins to prefer the state produced by practice over the truth disclosed by practice. That is the first turn. Practice no longer asks, what is being revealed? It begins to ask, how can I remain undisturbed? And from that point onward, anything that disturbs the student can be interpreted as an obstacle to practice. A person questions the student, and the student retreats into calm language. A contradiction appears, and the student calls it just thought. Someone points to confusion, and the student says, there is no one confused. That last one is especially convenient. The self vanishes exactly when accountability appears. Humanity's greatest magic trick, performed daily without a license. In the defense stage, spiritual language begins to protect the very structures it once had the power to expose. The same method that can reveal delusion can also be used to preserve it. The difference lies not in the outer form, but in the inner function. If a person sits in meditation and becomes more able to observe fear, that practice is functioning as exposure. If a person sits in meditation so they never have to confront fear directly, that practice is functioning as defense. Same posture, different function. If a person studies emptiness and becomes less attached to rigid views, the teaching is functioning as liberation. If a person studies emptiness and uses it to dismiss every challenge, every obligation, every wound, and every moral demand, the teaching is functioning as defense. Same doctrine, different function. If a person uses silence so that attention can deepen, silence is functional. If a person uses silence to avoid responsibility, silence has become armor. Same quiet, different structure. This distinction matters because spiritual traditions often preserve visible forms more easily. A community can maintain robes, rituals, chants, postures, vocabulary, and institutional continuity. The function drifts. This is one reason practice can become performance, then identity, then defense. The first stage says, "Look how I practice." The second says, "This is who I am." The third says, "Do not touch what this protects." By the defense stage, practice has become part of the student's psychological immune system. It detects threat, neutralizes discomfort, and preserves the existing self-structure. But the tragedy is that the self-structure being protected is often the very thing practice was meant to expose. The student begins the path seeking freedom from delusion, then gradually builds a spiritual system that protects delusion from being disturbed. This can happen in Zen with particular elegance, because Zen language is unusually easy to weaponize as a defense. Its vocabulary is sharp, minimal, and often paradoxical. It can cut through conceptual excess, but it can also cut off honest inquiry. It can point beyond the intellect, but it can also be used by people who simply do not want to think carefully. Amuse convenient, really. A tradition designed to go beyond concepts becomes a shelter for people allergic to precision. The human organism remains ambitious in its laziness. A student can say Zen is beyond words, when what they mean is, I cannot clarify what I believe. A student can say, there is no self, when what they mean is, do not hold me accountable. A student can say, everything is empty, when what they mean is, nothing matters enough for me to change. A student can say, just sit, when what they mean is, do not question the structure. Here, Zen has not disappeared. It has been repurposed. The language remains spiritual. The function becomes defensive. The defense stage is therefore not identified by whether a person meditates, studies, teaches, or chants. It is identified by what happens when something threatens the practitioner's constructed position. Does inquiry open, or does the system close? Does the person become more available, or less? Practice can become a defense when its calming, stabilizing, identity-forming effects are valued more than its revealing function. And once that happens, the practitioner may continue for years, even decades, without noticing the substitution. The cushion remains, the chant remains, the vocabulary remains, the image remains, but the edge is gone. The practice no longer cuts, it cushions. And when a practice that was meant to cut through illusion becomes a cushion for illusion, the path has entered a very different phase. That phase is where most students stop, not because they consciously choose falsehood, but because the defense stage offers something deeply attractive, a way to feel spiritual, a way to speak of emptiness without losing anything, a way to remain intact. In the defense stage, practice protects. In the weaponizing stage, practice attacks. That is the difference. Defense turns inward. It shields the practitioner from seeing what threatens the structure of the self. Weaponization turns outward. It uses spiritual language, posture, silence, doctrine, or authority to control what others are allowed to see, say, question, or feel. This is where the pattern becomes dangerous. Weaponized Zen appears when teachings are used not to clarify, but to dominate. A person invokes emptiness to invalidate another person's suffering. A person invokes non-attachment to shame, grief. A person invokes no self to erase responsibility. A person invokes silence to suppress criticism. A person invokes lineage to avoid examination. A person invokes spontaneity to excuse cruelty. A person invokes crazy wisdom to protect misconduct. At that point, Zen language has crossed a boundary. It is no longer functioning as a doorway. It is functioning as a weapon. And because the weapon is wrapped in spiritual language, it can be difficult for others to name what is happening. The person being dismissed may feel the distortion before they can explain it. Something feels wrong. Something feels cold, evasive, inverted. A teaching that should open space seems to close it. A phrase that should release fixation seems to produce submission. This is one of the clearest markers of weaponized Zen, not attachment, contact. There is less listening, less precision, less humility, less actual seeing. The teaching no longer brings the practitioner closer to reality. It gives them a superior place from which to avoid reality. The diagnostic distinction is this: a real teaching may challenge, unsettle, or expose self-deception. It may not be pleasant, but even when it is sharp, it clarifies. Weaponized teaching does not clarify. It destabilizes without illumination. It produces submission rather than insight. It makes the listener smaller without making reality clearer. That is the mark. The function is not liberation. The function is control. Someone speaks of suffering, and the weaponized response is, that is just attachment. Someone raises a concern about behavior, and the response is, there is no self who acts. Someone asks a sincere question, and the response is, you are trapped in concepts. Someone expresses grief, and the response is, everything is impermanent. True, also useless, if applied at the wrong level. Impermanence can deepen compassion. Weaponized impermanence flattens grief. It places doctrine where contact was needed. It confuses accuracy with wisdom. This is one of the central features of weaponized Zen. It uses true statements in false ways. A false statement can be challenged directly. A true statement used falsely is harder to expose. The speaker can retreat into doctrine and claim the listener is resisting the truth. The listener says, the speaker says, that is your ego. The listener says, you avoided the question. The speaker says, questions arise from dualistic mind. The listener says, this caused harm. The speaker says, there is no one harmed. At this point, the teaching has become structurally abusive, even if the speaker appears calm and even if the language sounds elevated. The phrase no longer points beyond delusion. It protects delusion from consequence. There is also the matter of the closed loop. Once defense and weaponization stabilize, the system begins protecting itself. Every challenge becomes proof that the defense is necessary. Every question becomes evidence of the questioner's delusion. If you agree, you understand. If you question, you are attached. If you object, you are egoic. If you leave, you were never sincere. This is not teaching. This is a closed system. A genuine path may be demanding and severe. It may require discipline. It may expose vanity. But it does not need to make itself immune to observation. Weaponized Zen makes itself immune. That is the diagnostic marker. It cannot be examined from within its own terms, because every examination is interpreted as delusion. This creates an elegant little prison if one admires terrible engineering, and many students remain inside it because the prison is decorated with sacred language. The visible curriculum says, awakening. The invisible curriculum says, do not question certain things. The visible curriculum says, do not become inconvenient with your pain. The visible curriculum says, let go of ego. The invisible curriculum says, protect the ego of the teacher, the institution, or the lineage image. The form continues. The function drifts. The distortion passes from teacher to student, from senior to beginner, from generation to generation, not as Dharma, as reflex, not as awakening, as defense wearing the face of awakening. So now a warning must be spoken plainly. To the student who uses Zen to avoid seeing, you are not beyond delusion because you have learned the language of emptiness. You are not free from self because you can speak about no self. You are not unattached because you can shame emotion. You are not clear because you can remain calm. You are not awake because you can dismiss questions. You may have only learned how to defend yourself more elegantly. And that is a serious danger, because the longer defense is mistaken for practice, the harder it becomes to detect. The language becomes smoother, the posture becomes more convincing, the explanations become more refined. The self learns how to hide inside the very teachings meant to expose it. That is not liberation, that is camouflage. To the student who weaponizes Zen against others, be careful. A teaching used to erase suffering is no longer functioning as Dharma. A teaching used to avoid responsibility is no longer functioning as wisdom. A teaching used to dominate others is no longer functioning as compassion. A teaching used to silence inquiry is no longer functioning as truth. You may win arguments, you may appear advanced, you may gain authority, you may intimidate beginners, you may sound profound in rooms where people are too uncertain to challenge you. But none of that means you see clearly. It may only mean that confusion has learned rhetoric, and rhetoric is cheap. Humanity produces it by the truckload, usually with a logo and a seminar attached, to the teacher who uses Zen as authority rather than exposure. The danger is greater, because students do not only learn what you say, they learn what you permit. They learn what you avoid. They learn how you respond when questioned. They learn how you handle pain. They learn how you manage contradiction. They learn whether your teaching opens reality or protects your position. If you use silence to avoid accountability, if you use emptiness to dismiss harm, students will learn erasure. If you use no self to escape responsibility, students will learn evasion. If you use lineage to prevent examination, students will learn obedience instead of seeing. If you punish clear questions, students will learn that clarity is dangerous. And if enough students learn these things, your teaching will continue outwardly while reversing inwardly. It may still look like Zen. It may no longer function as Zen. That is the warning. A teacher can transmit defense while believing they are transmitting Dharma. A student can inherit avoidance while believing they are inheriting wisdom. A community can preserve the form while losing the function. This is not theoretical. It is one of the ordinary ways spiritual systems decay. Not through obvious corruption alone, through subtle substitution, through unmanaged authority, through fear disguised as humility, through control disguised as compassion, through silence disguised as depth, through vagueness disguised as mystery, through slogans repeated long after they stopped revealing anything. A teacher who cannot be questioned teaches fear. A teacher who cannot acknowledge error teaches distortion. A teacher who cannot meet suffering without abstraction teaches abandonment. A teacher who treats every challenge as delusion teaches students to distrust reality. And if you recognize yourself here, if you recognize any part of this pattern in your own teaching, then the work is not to defend against this observation. The work is to look at it. That is, after all, what the teaching was always for. So the direction must also be plain. For the student, return to function. Do not ask only whether the words sound Zen. Ask what they are doing. When you say emptiness, does it open perception, or does it help you avoid something concrete? When you say no self, does it reveal clinging, or does it help you evade responsibility? When you say just sit, does it deepen seeing, or does it stop inquiry? When you become calm, ask whether clarity has increased. When you become silent, ask whether contact has deepened. When you feel superior, ask what is being protected. The direction for the student is not to abandon practice. It is to stop using practice as concealment. Let practice expose. Let it show the fear beneath the phrase. Let it show the identity beneath the posture. Let it show the wound beneath the doctrine. Let it show the self hiding inside no self. This is unpleasant work. Naturally, real practice often interferes with the self's preferred interior design. But without exposure, practice becomes maintenance. And maintenance is not awakening. For the teacher, return to accountability, not as performance, not as institutional policy language, that modern temple bell of managed sincerity, as actual function. Let questions be questions before you classify them as ego. Let pain be pain before you explain it as attachment. Let contradiction be examined before you dissolve it into paradox. Let students see you clarify, not merely control. Let them see you say, I was unclear. Let them see you say, that caused harm. Let them see you say, I do not know. Let them see you distinguish authority from realization. Let them see that silence is not a hiding place. Let them see that the Dharma does not need your image protected. The direction is not to soften Zen into comfort. Zen does not need to become therapy with incense. It does not need to become motivational content with better statues. It does not need to become a lifestyle brand for the spiritually over-accessorized. The direction is sharper than that. Restore the cutting function without turning it into cruelty. Restore silence without using it as suppression. Restore emptiness without using it as erasure. Restore no self without using it as escape. Restore discipline without turning it into domination. Restore directness without confusing it with aggression. Restore compassion without reducing it to sentiment. Restore inquiry without drowning in concepts. Restore tradition without preserving its evasions. This is possible. Zen in the West does not have to remain trapped in performance, identity, defense, and weaponization. It does not have to become a museum of borrowed Asian forms, nor a therapeutic comfort system, nor a personality accessory, nor a hierarchy of polished evasions. It can mature. It can become honest. It can become religious without becoming superstitious. It can become rigorous without becoming cruel. It can become compassionate without becoming sentimental. It can become disciplined without becoming authoritarian. It can honor its roots without turning them into theater. It can transmit form while preserving function. It can become what it should have been all along, a living path of seeing, not a performance, not an identity, not a defense, not a weapon, a path of seeing, a path that exposes confusion without humiliating the confused, a path that cuts delusion without cutting the person, a path that allows silence to deepen contact rather than prevent speech, a path that allows emptiness to open compassion rather than erase suffering, a path that allows no self to dissolve vanity rather than dissolve responsibility, a path where teachers do not hide behind authority, a path where students do not hide behind slogans, a path where practice remains dangerous in the proper sense, dangerous to illusion, dangerous to vanity, dangerous to spiritual self-importance, dangerous to the lies that survive because everyone is too polite, too afraid, or too invested to name them. When Zen is used to avoid reality, it ceases to function as Zen. When Zen is used to dominate others, it becomes a betrayal of its own cutting edge. When Zen is used to silence suffering, the silence is not awakening. When Zen is used to erase responsibility, no self has become the servant of self. And when Zen is used as a weapon, the one holding the weapon is usually the one most deeply defended. Lay down the weapon. Remove the shield. Return practice to seeing. Let the phrase become honest again. Let silence become honest again. Let posture become honest again. Let teaching become honest again. Let the student be exposed without being crushed. Let the teacher be questioned without becoming defensive. Let the community become strong enough to see itself. Perhaps then Zen in the West can become more than a transplanted form, more than a spiritual aesthetic, more than a defensive identity, more than a vocabulary for avoidance. Perhaps it can become a living fire, not a fire that burns people, a fire that burns confusion, a fire that burns pretense, a fire that burns the beautiful little lies people carry into temples, meditation halls, and online groups, because apparently even delusion wants community. If that fire is preserved, Zen can still bloom here, not as imitation, not as performance, not as weapon, as practice restored to its original danger, the danger of seeing clearly. And when seeing becomes central again, the path becomes possible again. The blade that was meant to cut delusion, lay it down and let it return to its purpose, not to wound, to cut through. That is enough.